the Union cause is sacred. And there really wasn't a lot of backsliding for that here. Massachusetts was the home of abolitionism, but the war wasn't about abolition at all. Initially, it was a war for the Union. Emancipation only became a cause later, but when it did become a cause, it was embraced, not heartily by everybody in the Union Army, but by many in Massachusetts particularly, because freedom meant also abolition to many of the young soldiers. In the meantime, before his death at Cold Harbor, like most soldiers in an era of widespread literacy, George wrote home frequently, reporting on his circumstances, speculating on the prospects for the war, and desperately inquiring about the well-being of loved ones so distant to him. If anyone's ever done any historical research, one of the things that you'll find I found shocking, at least initially, was just how literate people were in the 1860s. That was pretty widespread, north and south, north more than south in many ways, and New England the most, because what's really important about Protestantism, we have to remember, is it's important that you be able to read the Bible in English. And it's separated from Catholicism, and it's separated from traditions elsewhere, so it's very, very important. And as a result, most people, even people who are not highly educated, could read and write very well for themselves. And you'll see that in a lot of these farm boys who write these letters using vocabulary that today you would find a lot of people their age would not even understand or know how to use in a sentence. So it's pretty amazing. I came upon his previously unpublished letters quite by chance, but I was so moved by them that I digitized and transcribed them, then created that website that's up there, Resurrecting Lost Voices. But I also went on to conduct additional research. I found traces of George W. Gould's life in local communities and located his grave in Paxton, Mass., making a point to visit his resting place several times a year to place flags and wreaths as appropriate. This is just one of America's 250 years of personal stories, of course, but each one is significant. Just as the speakers before me who told about their family experiences, those are all significant. I wanted to speak about this guy because he doesn't have a family member to do that. And he died for something that's very, very near and dear. As a result, I think it's important to honor him. I'll tell you how I came into it. My connection with Private Gould was pretty serendipitous. Shortly before I encountered him, I was working on a capstone project to get my master's degree in history back in 2014. And I was fortunate enough to be part of a team working on a digital archiving project at the Mary and Lyman Wood Museum in Springfield in the Quad, which is a great museum, and they have a great archives in the basement, which most people are not familiar with. But we were resurrecting other lost voices, so to speak, of the 31st Infantry. The 31st Volunteer Infantry went with the notorious Benjamin Butler to New Orleans early in the war as an occupying force. And after the war, there were GAR, Grand Army of the Republic, branches everywhere, and veterans groups put together stories about their regiments, and wrote them all down. And in this case, in the early 1900s, they compiled all this information, they even typed most of it up, diaries, memoirs, letters, and all this stuff in this. And the guy who put it all together died suddenly. And so all this stuff went into a box. They never finished the regimental history. It was the only regiment from Massachusetts that has no regimental history. And it went into a box, and then somehow got lost in the archives for 100 years. And 100 years later, it's found in Springfield in the archives there. And so they get a grant from the state of Massachusetts for the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I happened to walk into this incredible opportunity as my capstone project for my master's degree to be a key member of the team digitizing these letters and memoirs and stuff. So that was very, very cool. While I was there, I met a young lady named Morgan Kolakowski-Shang, who was a graduate student working her way through. She also worked at the Staples store, which I used to go to all the time, because I'm a business owner, so I'm always buying stuff, But anyway, so we struck up a conversation, and one day she told me that her family had come into a collection of Civil War letters. I think she had an uncle who was an antique dealer or something, I don't remember the specifics, but they have these Civil War letters, and she wondered if I'd be interested in digitizing them. So, I jumped on the chance. I was like, well, this sounds cool, So I took the letters and I scanned them, and honestly, I didn't read them. I just scanned them because I had to return them. So the important thing was to make sure I had good quality scans. And then it's in cursive writing. So it takes a little bit of time to read through, even though he wrote beautifully. I put it aside though. And in the meantime, my son was in college at ECU in North Carolina for football fans. It's the Pirates. And we went down to visit him at school. And while we were in school, of course, being a Civil War nerd, I have to drag everyone away on a field trip. So we go to New Bern, North Carolina, where behind some random condo, there's these extant Civil War trenches from the Battle of New Bern from 1862. So of course, I'm really excited seeing these and actually walking by them. My son and my wife are kind of rolling their eyes, waiting for me to be done, being all excited about this and actually, get out of there. But that's, it was pretty much it. I went home, not really an important part of the story, except that when I got home, I sat down one night to read the letters. And when reading the letters, the very first letter talked about the fact that George W. Gould, from Leicester, Massachusetts, his very first place he's stationed is at Camp Oliver, which is in New Bern, where I had just been. So I was like, well, that's really wild. I mean, what a coincidence that is, right? So I had this connection right away, right? And then, I read his other letters, and he spoke of his commitment to the Union, his religious convictions, his experiences at the front. An especially heartbreaking letter reveals that while he was away, his young wife, Mira, died of typhoid fever at just 26 years old. And his 3 little girls were sent to live with their mother, whom George didn't really like very much. And then a letter in the spring of 1864 wondered at his own mortality as the war went on. But the very next letter I read, unexpectedly, was not from Private Gould, but rather from his commissary sergeant. And it was a letter to his mother telling her that George was dead, that he had fallen at Cold Harbor in a fierce firefight, and his body was left on the field. While reading it, quite unexpectedly, I felt hot tears streaming down my face. It was like somehow in the course of connecting with this guy who had been in New Bern, which I had visited, and reading these letters, I didn't expect this. I didn't know that he had died, so it really kind of struck me. But I decided at that moment that I was going to do more with these letters than just, file them in a folder somewhere on my computer. I decided I was going to create a website to honor him, and I began to do that. And as part of that effort, I also did some research about him. And I located his grave adjacent to an old church near the Green in Paxton, Mass. About an hour and a quarter from my home. I live in East Longmeadow, so it's not a short drive, but it's a very pleasant drive out there. And I began to visit several times a year, and I placed flags on the grave like Memorial Day and 4th of July and Christmas time as part of Wreaths Across America. Instead of sending them $25, I buy a wreath and I put it on his grave. So I'm actually participating in the moment. When I do this, I kind of feel like I'm not just honoring him, but I'm also honoring other soldiers who died, perhaps in other wars, to protect and sustain the United States with all of its imperfect ideals, to sustain it. And that means something, And he died in a particular war that was not very controversial, for us. For people who lived in Massachusetts, for people who lived in South Hadley, it was not a controversial war. It was a war that had to be fought. It was an existential threat. The Civil War and World War II are probably the only wars since the War of 1812 where you can say that. You can make cases for or against the other wars and military interventions, but the Civil War and World War II, pretty much we had to do that. So he died in something very, very important, and because he died, we saved the Union and we ended human chattel slavery. He was one of many hundreds of thousands of people over the course of the war who did that, but it was just as significant for him. It was his life, it was his family. His 3 little girls were orphaned. I think when we study history, we tend to lose sight of that sometimes. I know that when I went to school, it was remarkable that I got interested in history because most of the history teachers I had were just abysmal, just awful. And the whole time my daughter and my son were in school, I was angry all the time when I looked at their history homework, because they were made to memorize dates and generals and, who cares what the date of Gettysburg? What's the importance of Gettysburg? Why did we fight it? What was the war about? But unfortunately, that's the way. I had the good fortune in the 8th grade to have an incredible history teacher that just inspired me for life and showed me that these are stories. And what I'm talking about today, this is how history should be taught. You should be learning about why we did things and who the people are who are in it. It isn't generals and dates and, it's not that it's not important, but it's not relevant when you're learning it. You can always look that stuff up, especially today. Remember when your teacher told you wouldn't always have a reference book with you? Well, she lied because you always have a reference book between now. But you can always look up the date of Gettysburg, but you won't necessarily find immediately why it was fought, what happened at Cold Harbor. Anyway, I began to do more. In addition to these little flags I put on, I put little laminate tags on there with information about his life and the website. Hoping to actually resurrect his voice for a passerby. If somebody's going through that old cemetery and they see a flag there and they look at that little tag, maybe they'll go to this website. So that's kind of my hope. His headstone looked dirty, discolored. It was marked with lichen, like a lot of old stones, so I decided to do a little research on how to clean up a stone. I got an archival preservation kit, because if you do it wrong, you can damage the stone. And I spent an afternoon one summer cleaning the stone off so you could read the writing. So I kind of adopted the soldier's grave. And as I mentioned earlier, by adopting the grave, I kind of felt like it's not just about George W. Gould, it's about other soldiers. As I continued my research, I found a plaque with his name engraved upon it from an old GAR hall meeting hall in Leicester that had survived the fire, and it's now hanging in the hallway of the town hall in Leicester. Just there it is, George W. Gould killed at Cold Harbor. So it's interesting to find. I had the good fortune to connect with a local historian, Patrick McCune, who chased down a whole wealth of data on George W. Gould and his orphan girls that filled in a number of blanks on the website. It's frustrating that we only have a handful of his letters. That was only 12 letters. And there's no photograph of him in or out of uniform. Perhaps one day I'll come upon some of these other letters in his diary and maybe a picture of him somewhere. A lot of this stuff is out of context. If you go to, by the way, anyone who's ever been to an antique store, you'll see pictures of Civil War soldiers all the time. We have no idea who they are, unless somebody wrote their name on the back of it. And it was an important photo. If you're going away to war, that was one of the things you did, is you spent the money to have your picture taken so that you could leave that with your family, just in case you didn't go home. And also, you look really snazzy in your uniform and stuff. So there's thousands of these pictures were taken, hundreds of thousands of them, but most of them are either lost or they don't have any context. We don't know who they are. So maybe one day I'll find it. I'm still not giving up. I'm going to keep looking. But I treasure the letters that we do have. And I'd love to read you all of George's letters that I've transcribed, but of course there's no time for that. But I'm going to read you some excerpts that I think are important, just to round out this discussion, because without hearing, we can talk about resurrecting lost voices, but if you don't actually hear his voice, we haven't resurrected anything. We've just heard me speak, and it's not about me. So I'm going to read some excerpts to you, and then I would encourage you, for those who are interested, to go to the website. And there's flyers on the back table. Some of them were passed out. There's a QR code on the flyer, which if you scan it, you can get to the website. If you don't know what to do with a QR code, just find any 13-year-old and they'll tell you what to do with it. So it's pretty basic. All right, here we go. So the first excerpt I want to read you is actually not from George, but it's from his wife, Mira, who dies later. She's writing to her mother, telling what happened, and she tells us that he's, about his trip to New Bern. And she says that they got there, he was very seasick until the last day. They had pretty hard fare on their passage. When they got to Cape Hatteras, they brought there on board a lot of maggoty crackers, which was all they had to eat for a day and night. But when they got into camp, they had a good breakfast. He was in a rebel tent, one captured when the place was taken. He was well, but very tired. I answered his letters that night, but it takes a week to get a letter either way. So this is another thing we have to understand. There's a huge gap in time from in communication. Something we don't see in later wars. So there's people, even World War I and World War II. It took a while for a letter to go, but it was fast. And this was like a week. That was if you were lucky, and sometimes not. So that's 1862. The first letter I have from George is in 1863 in the spring, and he's at this Camp Oliver still in training, and he writes to his mom. And you have to think of yourself, when you were a kid, if you're ever away and missed your mom or your dad or your grandparents or whoever it was that was your mommy in your heart, whoever that person might be. Imagine what it is, you're far away from home. Now, the other thing I want to point out here is that people did not travel far from home. The reason why 2/3 of the people in the Civil War, soldiers, died of disease is for that reason. You were farm boys, you were away from people, what have you. Put you in a camp, you got measles, and there's no medication, and there's no sense of what to do about that. You have large numbers of people die. So not only do you see that, but you're also, the food sucks. It's awful, maggoty crackers perhaps. And you're all alone, and you're in a tent somewhere with a bunch of people you don't know. He writes, absent, neglected, though not forgotten, I will try to write you a few lines to let you know that I still live and am well, and hope this will find you all the same. It's been a long time since I've written to you or heard from you, and there's been a reason for my not writing. One reason was we'd not been paid for 6 months, and I couldn't get postage stamps to put on a letter, hardly enough to send home. There's not much news stirring here. Just now everything is quiet in this department, though there is stirring times in the Army of the Potomac. I do wish this thing was played out, but I don't see it as any nearer to the end than it was 1 year ago. But I ain't got but 17 months longer to go, so you see my time is most out. He ends up re-enlisting, so that's not true. Spoiler alert. Here we are in 1863. He talks a little bit about the war and what have you, but July 30th, 1863, just to give you some context here, we have the Battle of Gettysburg, 4th of July weekend. It's a great Union victory, but this right afterwards, there's huge draft riots in New York City. And people, including many African Americans, were murdered, and they end up having to send the war-weary troops from Gettysburg, who survived Gettysburg, to New York City to enforce order because of the rioting there against the draft. So he writes, I see, and this is, you go to his patriotism, his commitment to the war. Here he is, imagine you're away and you know, at war, and seeing your friends die, and of course you're hearing at home people aren't necessarily in favor of the war. We've seen this before. We can often justify with other wars. It's hard for us to understand this about the Civil War because it was so important, but yeah, that sentiment lurked, you know, and especially in New York. So he writes, I see by the papers that they've had some pretty bloody work in the North on account of this draft. I'm sorry to see there's not patriotism enough there to help sustain the Union. I should have thought that the late victories would have sent a thrill of joy to the hearts of the people there, and they would have been willing to turn out to a man and help to close up this war. But there's too many copperheads there for that, I see. Just the worst time they could take to rise. If it had been when our side was being defeated, I should not have thought strange of it. But we must take things as they come. But they may as well yield, for they will to the government of the United States has got to be sustained. And the time has come when we got a government, or else there's not halfway work about it. Every man refuses to do this at times is a traitor to his country and ought to be branded as such. So he's not just some guy who's in a field somewhere. He feels pretty strongly about the war, and he's articulate enough to write this. And again, this is some 29-year-old laborer. This is not a guy who has a high education at all. So I think that puts something in context as well. October 1863 is probably the saddest letter. He writes to his mom, life is short at the longest, and we ought so to live as to be prepared for death at any time. For we know not what a day may bring forth. We are admonished of the uncertainty of life every day. One after another of our friends pass away, and their places are left vacant, never more to be filled on earth. We miss their kindly greeting, and if they lived the life of a Christian and died in the faith, we can look forward to the time when we shall meet them again, never more to part. And then he goes on to say some other things, and then he says, you've probably received my letter informing you of the death of Mira. She was taken sick the 27th of August and died the 23rd of September. She was taken very violently at first and did not sit up any after the first day. Her mother was with her all the time. And they wrote me she seemed reconciled to the will of God and expressed her willingness to die if it was his will. It is now about 3 weeks since she died, and I can't realize that I shall see her no more. But if I should live to get home and see the vacant chair and the 3 little motherless children, I shall then realize my great loss. I cried while reading that letter also, and reading it today, it chokes me up again, you know. Talk about a resurrected lost voice, right? And just picturing that vacant chair that he's imagining, that he actually doesn't live to see. Later, 1863, he talks about the children and how they are. I'm not going to read this letter because it's a lot more of the same kind of thing, and I don't want to eat up into somebody else's time slot. I will tell you that he talks about his religion in another letter in 1863, and at the end of talking about his commitment to Christ and religion and what have you, and he only complains a little bit, by the way, of the other guys in the camp, you know, drinking and gambling and stuff. He's not one of those. You'll see a lot of religious soldiers write about, and all they talk about is how, you know, how arrogant they are, that they have a strong conviction, and this other guy's, you know, drunk. you know, but he doesn't do that. He mentions it at times, but he doesn't dwell on it. He's mainly focused on his own salvation and his own commitment. But he says, which I think is incredibly poignant, a rainy day in camp is the loneliest thing I know of, especially if you have a leaky tent. And today we have both a rainy day and a leaky tent. It has rained all day like a shower, and it is raining still. And then as we get close to the end here, he's talking about the engagements he was in. Shots and shells blew pretty fast. We've lost quite a number in killed and wounded. There have been 2 killed and a number wounded in our company. When I look forward to the future and think where this will all end, and it looks dark and gloomy, and God only knows whether my life will be spared to ever return, I sometimes think I have seen my children for the last time on earth, and you all but remember that there's a better land above where I hope to meet you all. It seems hard to leave my little ones to the cold cherries of the world, but I trust God will raise up friends that will protect them in the belief I commend them to the care of Almighty God and resign myself to His will. That's May 15th, 1864. It's about 3 weeks before Cold Harbor. It's the last letter I have from George. And finally, the letter I read that just made me break down was a very short one. Mrs. Gould, I have sad news for you. Your son, George W. Gould, was killed and left on the battlefield during a furious charge on a rebel work yesterday morning. We were repulsed, and it was impossible to bring his body off the field. The enclosed diary was in his breast pocket, and it tells where the ball hit him. He was a good soldier, always doing his duty. You have the consolation that he was a Christian soldier too, and has only gone before. I mean, right? You just feel it, you know? Here it is, reading this kind of thing. And just for those who aren't familiar with this, a little bit of context. If you see pictures of Civil War soldiers laying in the field with their jackets pulled up, it's because they're looking to see where they got hit. Because if they've been hit in the abdomen, they're going to die. And there is no way they can be cured. Like, there is no surgical technique. This is a time when there's no medication, and the surgeons did not have the capability to do anything for you. So if you were shot, you were either going to live or die. Some lived. Some, like Andrew Jackson, who was shot, a ball lodged near his heart. He lived the whole rest of his life with that ball lodged next to his heart. But they expected him to die. What's really tragic here is that there's a diary where he has written that he's been hit and he expects to die and where the ball's up, but we don't have the diary. So it makes it very, very sad on top of it. I'm not done researching this guy. I hope for those of you who've listened to this today that, you know, interest you enough to maybe read some of the other letters on the website. There's a blog on there that shows you his stone and a lot of other stuff that I've done with it. But again, more than anything else, it just inspires you to, I hope, honor other people. You know, find a grave of a soldier that you're interested in and adopt it. You know, put a flag on it. It doesn't take a lot of time and work. You don't need to go through what I did here, but you can still make a contribution. Thank you all for being such a wonderful audience. Please visit the website if you are interested further. And I leave you with that. I think everyone's doing a great mission here in Resurrecting Lost Voices. This was my particular resurrection. I hope it was useful.